All right, so this is to supplement some of our work on the hip flexors and the biomechanics related to the hip flexors for some of our yoga anatomy. The hip flexors, primarily here, we've got the hip flexors that go from the extremity or from the leg up to basically the hip or the iliac crest. And then we have other hip flexors that go more from inside the ilium or up into the spinal column, or up inside the spinal column down to the femur itself. And so these two different sets of hip flexors create a little bit of an overlapping. If we can keep him from falling over, or keep her from falling over. So when we start to work on those, we have the upper body work that comes from the spinal column and from the ilium down to the femur. And then we have stuff that comes from the femur that overlaps and comes all the way up and connects up to the ilium. So if we were to say that the ilium kind of had a position there. And so we have this area where there's an overlapping of the hip flexors. And some of the different issues with tight muscles in the hips and the low back can be related to different sets of the hip flexors being tight or over elongated and overtoned, which would be kind of a long muscle that's been stressed but isn't very well developed, so it's toned because of its stress. Or we can also have a little bit of hip hyperextension. So if we were to take somebody in standing, and this body is fairly well fixed, I'll try to move it, and we took the hips and leaned it forward, that's not going to work. So hip hyperextension in this would be a body position where we take the hip joint, and it's probably going to be most easily identified by the very top of the thigh, and it extends too far forward. So the hip hyperextension is going to take basically this junction right in here, top of the thigh bone, and just right about the hip bone that's just in the front there. And this region is going to start to protrude forward. What that's going to mean for the body is as this region protrudes forward, this area is probably going to collapse down and dump. And if it happens enough, you'll probably also get an entire pelvic tip underwards, or tip. The top of the iliac crest is going to move towards the back, and then the sit bones and the tailbone are going to move to the front. And this is going to make the low back, hopefully you guys can see this, this is going to make the low back get more flat, and the butt, the tailbone, are going to seem fairly flat and tucked under. This person is probably also going to have the thigh bone leaning back. It might even have a hyperextended knee. This would come up, and we would have a head there, gigantic head in this one. Yeah. But we're going to have butt tucked under, hips going forward, and even though it will seem like there's an arch, the lower part of the spine will be relatively flat. It'll seem like there's an arch because the general slope of the spine goes back in order to accommodate this bow-like posture. And the bow-like posture could be all the way from the shoulders all the way down to basically the feet, with the pelvis being like the front of the bow. And that would make a lot of tension right into the front of the hip. This would be top of the femur, and there would be your socket, and we would basically have the pelvis making a little bit of a semicircle there. So either way, that's going to relate to a lot of stress, either of the hip flexors that come down off the spine and attach into the femur, or from the ilium down into the femur. And depending on how much the pelvis is tipped, we're also going to have stress that comes from this little bony outcrop way down. We have a few different hip flexors that are going to be coming from the thigh region. The rectus femoris, which is going to come up a little bit lower than this bony outcropping, but it does a lot of hip flexion. And then we're going to have this small muscle that's related to your iliotibial band, and that is, sorry, I've been talking about a lot of muscles. That's going to be your tensor fasciae latae muscle, which is a strong hip flexor. And then we have this muscle that kind of winds from the very front of this, and that's going to wind just a little bit towards the inner thigh and the inner knee. And this is going to relate to a lot of this movement. So like you're playing hacky sack or something, or essentially like you're in pigeon pose if you are lifting it up and holding it just with that muscle. And that's going to be your sartorius muscle. So we kind of have two sets of hip flexors, and they cross right over the front of the pelvis right about here. And the two different sets allow you to have the pelvis in different positions and to articulate it in different positions for different types of ideal movement. But when you're collapsed or hyperextended at the hip, forward through the hip joint, how much stress gets put on the hip flexors coming out of the spine or the upper body or the axial body, or the hip flexors that are coming up from the thigh and the quadricep area, it's going to make quite a bit of difference in how you stretch. I would highly recommend that as you go to stretch these hip flexors, you don't perform the same hyperextension of the hip. And that's a longer discussion, lab work discussion on how to stretch either one of these sets while not hyperextending the hip forward and, in my opinion, exacerbating some of the hip issues and deeper issues in the acetabulum area as well. This is where we can run into some iliofemoral ligament issues and some impingement issues that I believe are related to hyperextension of the hip. The other downside with the hyperextension of the hip, besides the tone that it puts into these different hip flexors, is a lot of times the slouching or the collapsing of the low back seems to turn down the function of the low back muscles. And a lot of times with the pelvis extended towards the front, in other words, the pelvis is going to be in front of the center line of the body. The glutes will also tend to turn off. Either one of those, the low back muscles or the glutes, there could be a little bit of other musculature in there too. But either one of those groups of muscles firing would actually force the hips even more forward and create even more hyperextension and either damage or dysfunction. So a lot of times we'll see the glutes turn off and the low back turn off. And on the yoga mat, if we do stretching for these areas with even more hyperextension, we exacerbate a lower tone and activation of these muscles when we need them. How to fix these issues is a little bit of a different lecture topic, but it's important to bring up these hip flexors, how they're related to kind of an overextension or hypermobility. We see this a lot in the yoga stuff. And the breakdown of the activation of the muscles in the back. There's also jamming that goes into the sacroiliac joints and into the lumbar spine. And with the lack of activation of these low back muscles and the glutes, a lot of times we'll also see less tone and stabilization even in the ligaments of the SI joint. So one of the things that seems to show up a lot is with hypermobility and hip hyperextension and the turning off or turning down of the tone of the low back and some of the hip package muscles, we'll also find jamming when we're hyperextended in the SI joint area. And when we're in flexion, that might put some stress on the SI joint. With the lack of integration through that area, it seems like in those movements, the joint becomes hypermobile too. So a lot of importance on releasing hyperextension from the hip joint going forward, taking stress off of the hip flexors that's related to that hyperextension of the hip joint. And then once we're out of that, trying to create mechanics that's related to low back and the hip, a lot of our trunk muscles, trying to create some mechanics that integrate the hip flexors into an actual optimal, optimal function, which takes a little bit of work. That we'll get to on the mat later. Thanks a lot.